Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to remind you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, we have been working on wrapping up this conclusion of where we started this whole journey, looking at this question of where did we come from? And we've been addressing the two primary worldviews that we see competing in this arena. And what we've seen is that most ideas fall into one of these two worldviews, one of them being the naturalistic worldview. And in tonight's episode, as we look at evolution, that would be the neo-Darwinian worldview. But looking at this idea of all we need is time, chance, and matter. And if we just have enough of each, eventually life is just what happens. We talked about Stephen Hawking's quote that, basically a couple of molecules bumped into each other and life just seems to be what the universe does. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but we've talked about that in prior episodes and we've looked at that. The other idea that we've talked about is an idea of intelligent design, that creation is the best explanation for how we got here. And so we've been weighing these two worldviews against each other. And I know there are lots of different theories within each one, but most scientific theories fall into one of those two categories. The idea of necessity, I generally tend to reject. That's kind of the third option. And necessity tends to be naturalism with kind of this idea of sneaking in a little bit of intelligence and things like that. And ultimately, to get anywhere, it usually crosses the line on sneaking in too much intelligence. And ultimately, whether it realizes it or not, it becomes an intelligent design argument. So I've mostly kept this down to two different worldviews as we've talked about this. And in the first episode of this three-part series where we're wrapping all of this up, we talked about the idea of how we make our decisions, how we define our worldviews, and this idea that we looked at two bad choices. And one of them being this idea of we don't want to use a God of the gaps approach. We're not going to do that. Where we just simply look at things and say, well, that can't be explained right now, and therefore God is the answer. The second idea that we talked about that we did not want to do was to just, instead of God of the gaps, it's Lady Luck of the gaps. And at every step along the way, we insert Lady Luck, no matter how improbable, no matter how big the odds are, we just keep inserting enough luck. We've talked about this in previous episodes where we talked about the multiverse, that the idea of the multiverse is very appealing to a great many people to get around the mathematical impossibility of the fine-tuning problem. And the concept being that if we just have an infinite number of universes, eventually we just happen to be the lucky winners of the universal lottery. And sooner or later, somebody had to do it, and it was us. And I would contend that even if you had a nearly infinite amount of luck available to you, that's still not going to get you past things like fine-tuning. But again, as we talked about in that first episode, looking at Casablanca, none of us really live our lives that way. We all recognize that if we see someone winning over and over and over and over again at a casino or at the lottery or something, that it's been rigged, that the hand of intelligence clearly becomes visible because the odds always favor the house. And if someone keeps winning over and over again, you realize something seems wrong. And that's what we've seen a bit in this journey as we're doing this. And last week we talked about how this journey from the beginning of the universe to our little blue planet floating in space, there are three gigantic problems that naturalism can't explain. The jump from nothing to everything at the creation of the universe, the Big Bang, if you want to call it that. The problem of fine-tuning, and then the problem of our finely tuned little planet floating in space, the cumulative effect of everything that we see. And what we find when we look at all of those is we are the exact opposite of the Copernican principle. The Copernican principle being that we would expect to find that we are an ordinary planet with an ordinary moon, orbiting an ordinary sun in a very run-of-the-mill solar system, in a not-so-special galaxy, in the normal place inside that galaxy, in a universe that's just kind of, everything is normal and there's nothing special about any of it. And what we talked about last week was none of that is actually true. When we look at where we are, our planet, our moon, our solar system, our sun, where we're located in the galaxy that we're in, our solar system's journey to where it is today, and it's not just unlikely, it's remarkably impossible when you look at all of the various things piled together. And so what we find is that we are the exact opposite of the Copernican principle that we would come to expect. So the question we have to address this week is we actually turn our focus now to neo-Darwinian evolution, to this idea of random mutation and natural selection. Can they explain the emergence and the development of the diverse life that we find here on our little planet? And my contention is no. And I want to start us off looking at this idea. And I want to go back one more time to our quote from our friend Richard Dawkins in the God Delusion. Dawkins starts out here talking about this jump from lifelessness to life. And I want you to see how quickly he goes to this idea of luck. Once the initial stroke of luck has been granted, and the anthropic principle most certain decisively grants it to us, natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. Okay, he's talking a long ways down the line. Nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. For example, my colleague Mark Ridley in Mendel's Demon has suggested that the origin of the eukaryotic cell, our kind of cell with a nucleus and various other complicated features, such as mitochondria, which are not present in bacteria, was an even more momentous, difficult, and statistically improbable step than the origin of life. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. One-off events like this might be explained by the anthropic principle along the following lines. And then he goes on to talk about the scale of what he's talking about there. I want to go back to something he said there at the end. Another major gap whose bridging was of the same order of improbability. And I think this is where Richard Dawkins and I are going to depart from each other. There's a lot of places where he and I are going to depart from each other. But in fairness to his theory, I want to focus on that line for a minute. It is the scope of the problem, it is the magnitude of the problem that I think he understates time and time again when we talk about this. So just like last week when we looked at how we are the opposite of the Copernican principle, I want to wrap up our journey by looking at what is the neo-Darwinian principle, this idea that we're sold. In high schools, in grade school, and in college, and throughout our society, because we've been told, and I think this is maybe the strongest argument for evolution at this point, that evolution is settled science, that we can't question it. And it strikes me that that is the thread that evolution is hanging by as more and more evidence piles up, showing the inadequacy of the explanatory capabilities of the theory. So I want to walk you through this journey. At some point, and I think this is the neo-Darwinian model kind of in a nutshell. At some point, we would look to something like the Miller-Urey experiment from the 1950s. And we would point to Miller-Urey, even though we know they got a lot of things wrong, we would point to that theory and say, well, that is an excellent representation of how life might have originated. And once life originated, then you began this long, complex process where random mutation and natural selection took over. And what happened was, once you had that initial stroke of life, and this is where Dawkins recognizes, well, there's a real problem getting from that first single-celled organism to a more complicated cell. And he said, quoting that friend of his, that it's even more unlikely, that the odds are massively against it. We'll talk about why in a minute. But then what we should see is that one single-celled life form eventually branching off into all of these other diverse branches of life. You have plant life and birds and fish and mammals and all of these other things, and this incredible diversity that grows up into Darwin's tree of life. And we should expect to see that in the fossil record, and we should expect to see things like the Java man that are absolute evidence of that journey through the fossil record, showing us our evolutionary backgrounds. And we can look at things like Ernst Haeckel's drawings of embryos to show us that common ancestry in our development and across different kinds of species. And when we look at all of that, we can really just take that back and apply it all the way back to the beginning, to that single common ancestor. And this is kind of the picture that's been painted for us with these icons of evolution, and this idea that evolution has been proven, it's settled science, and it's just too big of an idea to fail. Except very nearly everything that I just laid out in front of you has been disproven to one degree or another. Ernst Haeckel's embryos, we've known since the 1800s that they were not good representations of the argument that he was trying to make. And I talked a lot about this in previous episodes. Please go back and see that. I think it was The Lies of Evolution was the episode, somewhere in the low 60s in the episode numbers. Please go back and review that episode and look at those. We talked about the enormous problems that Darwin's tree of life has. We spent an entire episode talking about cutting down Darwin's tree of life. The fossil record doesn't remotely show what it should show. That we have a very teeny tiny bit of life in the Precambrian strata of the geological record, and suddenly when the Cambrian strata arrives, you have this massive explosion of life already at a highly evolved state of development. And then throughout additional stratas, what we see is over and over again explosions of various types of life into the fossil strata, the geological strata. And we don't ever really see well pictured for us on a macro evolutionary scale what Darwin predicted. Darwin's tree of life doesn't exist. The fossil record, instead of being his greatest ally, condemns his theory as being wrong. And explanations to try to support it, I find to be not very intellectually satisfying. This idea that, well, it's just missing. I think the biggest idea that you find out there is this idea that, well, the fossil evidence is missing. It's probably out there somewhere, but it's kind of missing because you had rapid jumps in the evolutionary process. That's an idea that's not remotely supported by neo-Darwinian theory. Neo-Darwinian theory is supposed to be a slow, unguided process aided by random mutation. Random mutation and an unguided process are not going to get you the Cambrian explosion. When you go back and look at the Miller-Urey experiment, not only did they get the early Earth's atmosphere wrong, but the problem that we have is when we really go back and we look at this development of early life and the jump from lifelessness to life, what we find is that Miller-Urey's experiment is irrelevant, even if you could produce a few basic amino acids. What we've learned in the years since, and I'm going to I'll reference in the show notes, Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis, a great read. If you're a skeptic or if you're someone who believes in intelligent design, I would strongly encourage you. It is a well-sourced scientific read that is written at a level where the common person can come in and understand it with a little effort. But it addresses so many of these questions. And on Stephen Miller's YouTube channel, he and others like Dr. James Tour do an amazing job of going in and talking about this issue of how basically impossible it is that life could have arisen randomly, as we're kind of led to believe by things like the Miller-Urey experiment. You've got a sequence. It's not enough to just have building blocks. Those building blocks have got to be properly sequenced together. It's not enough to just have some proteins. They've got to be properly put together to get a functioning cell. And the odds of doing so at random are just, the more we learn, the more we realize it's just not possible. So at every step along the way that we've taken, what we find is that the picture that's painted for us from a neo-Darwinian perspective just falls apart. And at each step along the way, I want you to notice what we do find in all of this. And this is specifically not a God of the gaps approach, but I want you to think about this at each step along the way. The jump from lifelessness to life, what we find is that those amino acids and those proteins have got to be structured so carefully together. Those building blocks have got to be assembled to get a building. And the only thing capable of doing that is an architect and a contractor who go in and build things. We know that in every other area of our life. The best explanation when we find something that's been put together, a complex working machine like the cells inside of us, that Dawkins even admits, well, it may be even more statistically improbable to go from a early simple cell to the complex cell that makes up us. And again, what he's saying there is there's not a good roadmap, because the cell that makes up us is this finely tuned machine that does things like we can't possibly imagine. I've talked about other quotes before talking about what the cells inside of us. There's an entire episode again that we spent talking about the cells inside of us. And when we find a machine that's put together, when we pop the hood on our car and we look at something like an engine, we recognize, well, the only way the engine comes together is, well, an engineer. a team of engineers who put that engine together and they built that car. And we recognize that under our hood, but when we dig down deep inside of us, it's somehow we go, well, but we could have just happened by chance. And we're far more complex than the average engine under the average car. And so again, the best explanation when we see something like the complexity of the cell is an intelligent mind. We recognize that in every other area of our life except this one, oddly. And then we get to the DNA, the intelligence that is inside, the DNA inside of us. And what we find when we look at this, every time we see computer programming in our lives, in this digital world that we live in, we recognize the hand of a programmer. But when we look at DNA, the DNA that makes up us and everything around us, somehow we go, well, that programming could have just happened on its own through random mutation. When has random mutation ever helped your computer? When has a randomly mutating operating system ever produced an upgrade in our experience? And the programming that makes up you and your DNA is infinitely more complex than the operating system on a Mac or a PC. But yet we somehow understand that the programming inside your computer could have only come from a human mind. But the programming that makes up us somehow naturally occurred. And again, I would argue that the best explanation is that of a programmer, of an intelligent mind. And then what we looked at this idea of all of the complex traits that life shares. Vision and balance and hearing and the ability to move, joints that move in multiple directions. I've got a joint here on my arm and my shoulder, one at my elbow, and then here at the wrist, and all of these fingers that do such complex things. When we look at things like that, and all life seems to share very similar common traits. And we talked about the problem that caused here a few episodes ago, trying to figure out, well, which came first, and trying to apply this all to his credit, Richard Dawkins' idea of climbing Mount Improbable. And we talked about why that concept just doesn't work. We spent an entire episode looking at just our balance, the semicircular canals in our ears, and how improbable, if not just completely impossible, it would be for not only the concept of something like that to develop, because we take for granted that somehow the concept of balance or the concept of sight could be derived in a purely evolutionary model and not by the focus of an intelligent mind. We just take for granted that the idea could occur and then the body could somehow begin evolving toward it up this Mount Improbable just seems to defy credulity. But again, we just assume that it happened. And it didn't just happen once. It happened over and over and over and over again for all of these complex traits and for all of these complex species. So it didn't just happen once. It happened hundreds, if not thousands of times over and over. And when we look at the complexity of these traits, when we look at the human eye, or we look at the idea of the semicircular canals in our ears, this idea of balance, we just seem to write off and go, well, it could have happened. Darwin himself, when he had to explain the human eye, skipped the actual beginning and just jumped in with a starting point of, well, a light-sensitive nerve, a light-sensitive optic nerve, and he went forward from there. No, he should have started with nothing and then gone to the light-sensitive optic nerve. That's where the rubber meets the road. And as we've talked about before, a neo-Darwinian theory lacks good explanatory capability when it comes to the beginnings of anything. We just have to assume vision is a concept that the body begins evolving towards. Well, how? How does it start that process? How do you begin balance? How do you begin hearing? How do you begin smell? How do you begin any of these things? The idea of a designer clearly jumps forward as the best explanation, and this is the thing, on any single one of them. If we just focused on eyesight, it seems incredibly unlikely, but I guess maybe if we allow Darwin to kind of jump to maybe a third of the way up the mountain and start there, maybe. But if you think about all of the complex traits and you put them all together, are we really to believe that every single one of them evolved one at a time, over and over and over again, in all of the different species to remarkable degrees of similarity? Again, it seems impossible because it is impossible. And then finally, as we started to touch on this idea of irreducible complexity, and that's what we've been kind of touching on, this overarching theme of what's going on in our ears when the semicircular canals to provide us with balance is such a complex device that if you take out any one piece of it, the whole thing collapses and it doesn't work. And so when you look at something like that, you have items inside your body that are irreducibly complex, that if you take out one working part, the whole thing collapses. And whether that's a function like eyesight, or whether that's a system like the reproductive system, we spent an entire episode talking about that, or the central nervous system, the respiratory and cardiovascular system, the skeletal system, the digestive system, the nervous system, all of these different things. When we look at each one of them, you get this which came first, chicken or the egg problem that just haunts neo-Darwinian theory. My digestive system is necessary to provide my body with the nutrients to keep me going. How did this complex system evolve inside of me? Because without it, I will die. And so at some point, there had to be something else, more simplistic, that was capable of keeping me as a human alive and feeding nutrients into my body. But at some point, you had to make the jump from that other system to the one I have today. And I understand the argument's going to be, well, one step along the time, the system improved. But at some point, again, you have this enormously complex group of things going on inside of your body from start to finish to provide the nutrients, to get rid of waste, to break down all the things that your body needs, to digest food, to chew it up, to do everything from start to finish. All of those different things, at some point, your body didn't do that, and then at some point it did. And I understand once it's up and working, you could go from a simple model to more complex. But what did you have before it worked? And if you had a working digestive system other than the system that we have today, that was working previously to this, how did the body know that it needed an improvement? And when you look at the complexity of what we have, how does that happen outside of in one step? The reproductive system is the best example because not only do you have the internal components, you have the external interfaces, which we talked about in a PG-rated episode, talking about those external interfaces. But how do you go, except in one generation, from an entity that is capable of self-reproduction to an entity that requires male and female, both with internal working parts that have to match up and external interfaces that have to hook up? How does that happen? And so in each step along the way in all of this, the answer I think that we recognize is the hand of an intelligent designer has far more explanatory power than, well, random chance and just enough time, it could have happened. Over and over again, we see this at every step along the way. And again, this is not a God of the gaps approach. No amount of time is going to make the evolution of the reproductive system, the development of the reproductive system, let me use a better word, no amount of time is going to make that any less probable. No amount of time is going to make the information contained in our DNA suddenly more likely to have happened by random chance. We know too much about how computer coding happens. When you look at each one of these steps along the way, and you look at the journey we took last week from the beginning of the universe to our little blue planet, at every step along the way where we face one of these major decision points, when you look at them individually or you look at the cumulative impact of many of them together, what we see is the hand of an intelligent designer, architect, programmer, construction designer, whatever you want to call it, engineer. At every step along the way, what we see is the handiwork and the fingerprint of intelligence. In every other area of our life, we recognize that. It's only when it comes to us that we go, well, if you just stacked luck, one on top of another at every one of these steps along the way, and you just gave us enough time, luck, and chance, it could have happened on its own. Do we really believe that? In no other area of our life would we say yes, but somehow when we look at us, we're willing to go, well, it's better than the alternative. And I want you to consider for a minute that the alternative just might be a creator who loved you so much, he gave everything for you. A creator that built all of this for you to give you the opportunity to spend eternity with him. for you to have that chance to make that decision. A creator that did all of this for you is the alternative. And the closer we get to God doesn't mean we're less scientific. God didn't just throw open the book and say, hey, well, here's the recipe book. This is how I did it. He has allowed us the opportunity to open up these doors and these discoveries. And what I would tell you is, as I've made this journey, what has blown me away is the enormous care and complexity and just the detailed workmanship that makes up us. And it brings you closer to a creator, to do the scientific homework, to do the research, to figure out how the universe is put together. It reveals the hand of a creator who loves us even more than we knew 100 years ago. What I would encourage everyone to do is to go back and look at some of those episodes. If you've got something that you look at and say, yeah, but I really tried to address those topics in previous episodes. And again, when you look at the cumulative weight of the entire journey, I'm not saying on some of these that it's not possible that eyesight could have developed on its own. I guess it possibly could have. As I look at the complexity of the human eye, I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. But you may, and that's okay. We can agree to disagree on that. But at every step along the way, do we really think that luck is the answer? That time, matter, and luck answers all of these questions? And that the common thread that we see in all of this is the best explanation for every one of these is the hand of an intelligent designer. And like I said, I understand there's a few of them along the way that you could pick off and go, well, that one I think could probably have happened. That one could have happened just by random chance. I'll grant you a few, but this many in a row? This is not something that's going to be undone by future scientific discoveries. And the reason I say that is we've arrived at these conclusions because of the pace of current scientific discoveries. What we've learned helps us to understand what we're seeing so much better. It was in the 1950s, ironically, as Miller and Urey were doing their experiment, that Francis Crick was discovering DNA. And what we've learned about the information contained in DNA, and I know I've gone back to this several times, but what we've learned in our digital age that we have today is that the information contained in DNA had to come from a programmer. No amount of scientific discovery that we're going to make down the road is going to change that. So I would encourage you, go back and look at these various items, these decision points that we've had along the way, where we've said the best explanation is that of an intelligent designer. And take a look at that. Ask that question, do I really think that time, matter, and luck is a more likely explanation than the fingerprint of intelligence? And this is where we have to start weighing the evidence. And as what we've seen as we look at this is that the most current scientific evidence that we have today is growing closer and closer to this idea of an intelligent designer. As we peel back the onion, as we look at this question of what makes up us, what makes up our universe, what we see is that random chance just doesn't cut it. And that's what I want to encourage you to do, is to take a look at that. Take a look and step back and just consider, if I walked into that casino at Rick's Cafe in Morocco and I saw somebody hit at the roulette table twice, would I be that same guy who asked the question, is this place honest? It's honest. It's as honest as the day is long. But you know it's not. And if somebody hit the roulette table twice, you'd go, okay, this game is rigged. What if somebody hit the roulette table 30 or 40 times in a row? You would know that the guy spinning the ball has got his finger on a button somewhere that is changing the odds. You would recognize the handiwork of intelligence. A cheat, but intelligence nonetheless. And I submit to you that that's what we see here. When we look at the journey from nothing to where we are today, what we see is the clear fingerprint of an intelligent designer. And that is where I want to leave you today. We're going to clean up a couple more things. We have a couple more things to talk about in next week's episode. And then we're going to shift in some other areas that I believe point the finger at the handiwork of an intelligent creator. The question of objective morality. What is the best explanation for objective morality? Is it a moral lawgiver, or is it just the random, development of certain societal ideals and things like that? So we're going to shift gears and start talking about that in the episodes to come. I know we went a little bit long on this one. I really appreciate you sticking with me. I think it was worth it to wrap up this journey. I want to thank you so much for joining me. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you will consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. If you're joining us on iTunes, I hope you'll consider hitting the follow button. If you're on Spotify, I hope you'll consider following us there. You can find our podcast, obviously, on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. You can find more information on our website at prooftograce.com. And you can reach out to us via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we'll see you next time. Have a great and wonderful day. Bye-bye.